Cuphead bosses are notoriously difficult, but they're also some of the most imaginative, mechanically impressive, and visually striking bosses in all of gaming. Studio MDHR did a bang-up job designing these enemies, and they recently graced us with a whole new slew of challenging fights via the Delicious Last Course DLC. Now that we've had some time to sink our teeth into the DLC, we figured it was high time we did a complete ranked list of all Cuphead bosses. And we do mean complete. This list will feature all the main bosses from the base game, all the mini-bosses, and all of the Delicious Last Course bosses, complete with a secret boss fight. In total, we're looking at no less than 40 different bosses. Now before we get started, just keep in mind that this is largely a subjective ranking, since everybody experiences the game a bit differently. The bosses we found to be the hardest might very well be the ones you beat in a couple tries, and vice versa. With all that out of the way, join us as we take a look at every Cuphead boss ranked by difficulty. Mangosteen is one of 9 mini-bosses you'll have to defeat before facing off against King Dice. All of them are pretty easy to deal with compared to the main Cuphead bosses, but Mangosteen is arguably the weakest of the bunch. The mini-boss's sole attack is breeze to dodge, and his accompanying billiard trucks don't pose much of a threat either. This fight should not take you more than 20 to 30 seconds if you know what you're doing. Pirouletta is another one of King Dice's henchmen. Just like the aforementioned 8-ball, this mini-boss only has a single attack. However, she also dances around the room from side to side, and will trample you to death if you're not careful. The standard way of avoiding her when she dances is by parry slapping the poker chips, but you'll have a much easier time simply using the smoke dash charm instead. With the charm equipped, you'll be able to make short work of Pirouletta in no time. Next up we have Chips Bettigan, and you're probably starting to see a pattern by now. Most of these mini-bosses are pushovers, so there's no way we could have ranked them anywhere else but the bottom. To be fair, a few of the mini-bosses can be fairly challenging, but that's not the case here with Chips Bettigan. The only reason why Chips is higher on the list than prior to is because his attack, while easy to dodge, can be a bit unpredictable. We've all seen magicians pulling rabbits out of hats, but what happens when said rabbits are the magicians themselves? Well, you'll get something like Hocus Pocus. This magical bunny has a couple of tricks up his sleeves, including an attack where he summons a circle of rabbit skulls that surround the player. This attack is pretty hard to dodge if you're not using the smoke dash charm, which is why we're placing Hocus Pocus higher than some other mini-bosses. Finally, we can start talking about some of the Cuphead DLC bosses. You'll run into a bunch of chess-themed mini-bosses during Delicious Last Course, including these guys. Fittingly enough, the pawns are the weakest challengers and can be dispatched with relative ease, provided you're good at parry slapping. You can't shoot the pawns, the whole fight revolves around slapping and jumping. While it's a bit annoying at times, the fight is relatively easy by Cuphead standards. Smoking can kill you in real life, but in Cuphead, you can kill smoking. Or at least the personification of it known as Mr. Wheezy. This cigar mini-boss isn't very tough, but he moves around quite a bit and his looping fireballs can be pretty annoying. In addition, you also have to dodge cigarette bats whenever Mr. Wheezy teleports between ashtrays. There's more going on in this fight compared to the other ones we covered so far, but ultimately, Mr. Wheezy should pose a very little challenge to an experienced Cuphead player. Phear Lap would definitely be much higher up on this list if we're ranking Cuphead bosses based on the design. Not only are you beating a dead horse, but you're doing it at a horse racing track, and you're getting gifts straight from the horse's mouth. People say you shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth, but you should definitely try avoiding the gifts coming out of this horse's mouth. I'm sure there are some other puns and sayings centered around here, but you get the idea. This may not be one of the hardest boss fights, but it's definitely one of the most cleverly designed ones. You really have to love the design of some of these bosses. The Tipsy Troop is a trio of alcoholic drinks that work together when trying to take down the player. Each of the 3 drinks has different attack, and while individually the attacks are nothing to write home about, they are a nuisance when combined together. Fortunately, once you take one of these drunken rascals down, you also stop one of the trio's attacks. This is one of those rare instances when the boss fight becomes progressively easier, All you really need to worry about is the first part of the fight when all three are attacking. Next up we have another casino mini-boss, or should I say bosses? Pip and Dot are a dynamic domino duo you have to fight while on the move. The stage itself is the biggest hassle here, as you'll need to constantly jump over spikes while dodging attacks. Pip and Dot's attacks are slow and well telegraphed, but they can still hit you if you're not paying attention. Ultimately though, the stage is the main reason why this boss fight is so high up on this list. Pip and Dot are pretty easy to deal with themselves. The Queen is one of the most intimidating DLC mini-bosses due to the sheer number of things flying all over the screen during the course of the fight. Her main attack can be difficult to dodge, but it doesn't take more than a couple tries to get used to the pattern. Her secondary attack is much easier to deal with by comparison. You'll need to once again make good use of those parry slaps, not just to negate the secondary attacks, but also to fire the cannons that you can't shoot at her directly. The Rook is one of the least interesting Cuphead bosses in my opinion. I really like the design of this boss, but the fight itself is not very memorable. Instead of fighting the boss directly, you'll spend the entire fight parrying pink heads spawning out of the Rook's grindstone. You'll need to hit each head a couple times to send it flying back towards the boss and damage him. You can easily mess up and get damaged by the head yourself, or the projectiles coming out of the grindstone, but the challenge level of this fight is still ultimately quite low. Mr. Chimes is another one of those bosses you'll encounter in the casino before fighting King Dice, and this one may end up giving you a run for your money. This fight is pretty unique as it involves a memory game where you have to match various pairs of cards. You won't be able to start fighting Mr. Chimes until you find at least one pair, but be careful because this monkey fights back and has a lot of health points. The Mr. Chimes battle can drag on for quite a while, especially if you're bad at minigames, which is why we're placing this monkey higher than all the other casino mini-bosses. Goopy Le Grande is by far one of the easiest Cuphead bosses, which shouldn't be too surprising considering he's one of the first bosses you encountered in the game. You'll spend most of the first phase dodging Goopy's bouncing attack, while occasionally evading his punches. Phase 2 is pretty much identical, except for the fact that Goopy is larger and has more range. Meanwhile, the third phase requires patience more than anything. Goopy Le Grande is a great boss to introduce players to the game, but the fight isn't particularly hard. Same with this next one. If you don't want Goopy Le Grande to be your very first Cuphead boss fight, your only other option is the Rook pack. This one's a bit harder, but not by much. Probably the most interesting aspect of this fight is the ability to skip the second phase, and instead unlock a secret phase. Skipping phase 2 speeds things up quite a bit, but it also makes phase 3 considerably harder. Now, instead of fighting just Chauncey Chantenay, you also have to deal with a new vegetable-themed enemy called Horace Radish. King Dice is one of the toughest Cuphead bosses if you include all of his minions to be part of the fight, which is technically how this works. They're not too difficult to deal with individually, but together, they combine to provide the player with one hell of a challenge. But since we're ranking bosses individually here, King Dice by himself is not particularly strong. The fight does require good timing and precision, but only features one single phase. Once you figure out how to slap the cards with taking damage, this fight becomes a breeze. Knights used horses to charge into battle, but in the world of Cuphead, it looks like knights are horses, or at least this one is. Going up against the knight feels like playing a fighting game. This is a one-on-one duel taking place inside a small arena, and you don't have to worry about weird stuff flying over the screen. The knight is a melee combatant that fights with a sword and shield and alternates between several attacks. Now, in typical video game fashion, the knight has one single weak spot you need to repeatedly slap in order to damage him. Not the toughest fight, but definitely one of the more interesting DLC bosses. Cuphead bosses often come in pairs. This particular pair is comprised of boxing frogs with lots of tricks up their sleeves, or up their gloves or something I guess. The first phase is just a bit of a warm-up, with the real fighting kicking off in phase 2 when Ribby and Croaks flank the player while attacking simultaneously. The third phase is not to be sneezed at either, but you shouldn't have too much trouble clearing it provided you don't get distracted by how odd and weird it is. Ribby and Croaks are fairly tough for a couple of Isle 1 bosses, but there are still way tougher opponents to come. Next up on the list of Cuphead bosses ranked by difficulty we have Bishop. I'm sure some people will disagree, but I feel like this is the hardest mini-boss in the game. The fight requires you to jump around a lot while dodging bells as you attempt to put out candles. Once all these candles have been extinguished, you can slap the bishop around, or rather his head. But you'll only be able to get a single hit in before the head recoils and starts lighting up candles again. Then you rinse and repeat until the fight's over. Although I really love the design of this boss, the fight itself is a huge hassle. Easily one of the most iconic Cuphead bosses thanks to its design, Cagney Carnation can be encountered towards the end of Aisle 1. This flower boss only has 2 phases, but they're both pretty difficult to deal with. In Phase 1, you'll need to do a lot of jumping between platforms while dodging falling projectiles, boomerangs, and more. Luckily, Phase 2 is even easier if Cagney's attacks get faster, so if you can get past that first phase, you should be golden. While the base game does have a few secret phases, there are no secret bosses. Thankfully, we just recently got a secret boss fight via the delicious last course. This fight looks intimidating at first because it seems like you're going up against 2 opponents at once. However, you actually only have to worry about the devil since the angel's attacks do not hurt the player. The devil will always face the player, so it's best to avoid turning unless absolutely necessary. The secret boss fight is moderately difficult, but it doesn't have multiple phases, so it shouldn't take too long to beat once you figure out the attack patterns. Glumstone the Giant is one of the first bosses you'll encounter in the Delicious Last Course DLC. This boss makes a great first impression as he summons flocks of geese with his whistle nose and reveals the potion brewing gnomes living in his mouth. It's all very weird and wonderful. There's a lot going on in Phase 1, but things do dial down a bit in the other 2 phases. An enjoyable fight overall, but only moderately difficult. Next up, we have the sweetest Cuphead boss ever, Baroness Von Bon Bon. This is one of those fights that can vary in terms of difficulty, so it's a bit hard to rank, but here at 19 does seem appropriate. The Baroness has 5 loyal subjects, and she'll force you to fight 3 of them before engaging you herself. Some of these opponents are harder to dispatch than others, and the game assigns these challenges at random. This fight will be harder for some people than others depending on each player's luck. On the bright side, at least you can expect the last phase to be sane every time. A lot of people find Captain Brineybeard to be one of the most annoying of all Cuphead bosses, and it's easy to see why. The fight looks deceptively simple at first, until you realize that you're fighting not just a captain, but a ship as well. Oh, and there are also various sea creatures to deal with, and there's this annoying barrel thing that hangs over you throughout the entire fight. But the most frustrating thing is the fact that Phase 1 seems to last forever, even though it's technically split into 3 different phases. There's no crazy transformations here like with the boss fights. That only happens in Phase 4. I'm a bit surprised it took MDHR this long to make a boss fight revolving around bootlegging and criminal games, considering the game's inspired by the 1930s when Prohibition was still a thing in the US. In any case, I'm glad they eventually did it, and I'm even happier that it turned out so well. The Moonshine Mob fight is awesome and one of the funniest in the Delicious Last Course DLC. No, the entire game. The fake knockout in Phase 3 is absolutely brilliant, and I'm sure it probably got a handful of golden players killed. Aisle 3 is where things release at the ramp up in Cuphead. Every boss here will test your skills to a greater or less extent, including Sally's Stageplay. She's one of the weaker bosses in the island in my opinion, but she's definitely not to be underestimated. This is a 4-phase fight with some optional secret phases that can be triggered by dropping a chandelier on Sally's husband. Interestingly enough, the first half of the fight is arguably much harder than the second half, regardless of whether or not you activate these secret phases. Do your best to fight the first half, and you shouldn't have much trouble clearing the second one. The Werner Werman boss is basically just a twisted version of Tom and Jerry. Jerry's were a slang term used by the British during World War I to refer to the Germans, who in turn called the British Toms. Hence, why the Cuphead version of Lovable Mouse has a German name. Fun facts aside, the reason why we're placing Werner Werman so high up on his list is mainly because of the stage. You need to fight Werner in a very confined arena where there's little room for error. Things get pretty claustrophobic at certain points during the fight, especially during Phase 2. You'll need both skill and precision with this one. Alright, it's time to look at some new Cuphead bosses again, starting with Mortimer Freeze. This fight is pretty intense from start to finish and involves a lot of moving around. The first phase isn't too bad if you can manage to dodge the icicles, as Mortimer's other 2 attacks are slow and well telegraphed. Phase 2 gets a bit harder, but it's a 3rd phase you'll want to watch out for. Here, you'll need to fight on constantly moving platforms while evading 4 different types of attacks. If that wasn't already bad enough, the boss zips from one side of the arena to the other when you least expect it. Hilda Berg is the first Cuphead boss that elevated my heart rate to dangerous levels when I first played the game. The bosses on Island 1 are relatively easy to beat, as one might expect from the opening section of the game, but that's not really the case with Hilda. Not only is this the first aerial boss battle the game offers, but it also has a ton of phases. Similar to the Baroness Von Bon Bon fight, some of the phases are randomized, so you'll never know what to expect. The hardest part about this boss, in the last phase in particular, those UFOs. They're so annoying, and I just hate them so much. Cuphead gives aerial dogfighting a whole new meaning with the Howling Aces, a boss fight where you fight actual dogs. The first 2 phases are filled with all sorts of silly nonsense, like a bulldog pilot using a cat as a cannon, and jetpack-wearing puppies barking letters at you. It's all great fun. However, the biggest highlight is definitely Phase 3, where the Chinook dog flips the entire screen, testing your spatial awareness in the process. Easily one of the best moments of the DLC, and the rest of the fight is not too shabby either. Is it just me, or are all the aerial bosses in this game just really, really hard? The fight against Djimmi the Great isn't really that difficult compared to some others, but it's still enough to frustrate you to no end. The first phase really sets the tone for what to expect here. Djimmi pulls out a treasure chest filled with only 3 things. If you get the jewels, just restart, it's not worth it. There are no less than 4 additional phases after that, each more annoying than the last. Now phase 4 can be skipped, but doing so will make the last phase even harder. Either way, you'll have your work cut out for you with this one. It's pretty clear that this fight was designed to raise our anxiety levels through the roof. And you know what? It did it! This is exactly what it's designed to do! Good job, MDHR. Seriously though, the fact that you have to jump from platform to platform throughout the entire fight makes this one of the few instances where the stage itself is more infuriating than the actual fighting. Don't get me wrong, Rumor Honeybottoms is a difficult boss, especially during the 3rd phase, but it's that platforming that always gets my goat. Now here's a real high-class bout. This is one of those fights that looks like a lot of fun when you're watching someone else play it. Try to play it yourself, however, and you'll quickly find out that Beppi the Clown is not all fun and games. Now admittedly, the first phase is pretty easy, but the fight gets progressively harder with each subsequent phase, and there are 4 of them in total. By the end of it, you're probably going to hate clowns and balloon animals and merry-go-rounds and just anything about amusement parks in general. Don't even get me started on those penguins. I hate those penguins. This has to be one of the most beautifully animated and charming boss fights in the game. Don't get too distracted by the siren though, because Cala Maria also happens to be one of the most difficult Cuphead bosses. The fight only has 3 phases, but each of them drags on forever thanks to Cala's significant health pool. It's a good idea to get more health yourself in this fight because there's a lot of stuff that can hurt you here. Cala can stun the player in both Phase 2 and Phase 3, so chances are you're probably going to get hit at least a couple times before the end of this fight. Wally Warbles is a cuckoo bird encased in a cuckoo clock, and he's also more than a bit cuckoo judging by his fighting style. Phase 1 seems pretty manageable at first, since all you have to do is dodge mags and the occasional finger bullets. But once Wally starts flapping around furiously and sending feathers all in all directions, you're in trouble. Dodging the feathers without taking any damage requires a ton of precision, especially when he performs the attack twice in a row. The last 2 phases are comparatively easier, but they're definitely not a walk in the park by any means. Holy cow! Esther Winchester has to be one of the most imaginative and disturbing Cuphead bosses ever. The fight starts off with the player going up against a literal cowgirl, but things get even more bizarre in Phase 3, which it turns into sausages and begins chucking steaks at you. Esther is so relentless that she keeps fighting even after transforming into a can of meat in Phase 4. You do have to appreciate that sort of fighting spirit. Hats off yet again to MDHR for designing these incredible boss fights. The level of creativity is off the charts in this battle where you have to fight against the inhabitants of a ghost train, and then eventually the train itself. The fact that you're stuck on a relatively small platform for the entirety of this fight makes this level extremely punishing. Not just that, but you also have to operate the platform yourself. The entire encounter is pretty brutal, but the final phase has to be the most memorable one. Not just because of its difficulty, because you're fighting a train that gallops like a horse. Kudos to whoever came up with that idea. Next up we have Cuphead's final boss, the devil himself. This guy is so confident in his powers that he spends most of the first phase just sitting on his throne. The ego. I guess you can lean back and relax when you have incredible magic powers. You know, like the ability to turn your head into a giant spider, for example. Personally, I suggest saving up your super for phase 3, because that's the hardest one of the bunch. The final phase could prove even more difficult for some players since you only have one platform remaining and nowhere to run. However, the devil only has a few hit points left by now, and he goes down pretty quickly. To call Grim Meshnik one of the most difficult Cuphead bosses would be a bit of an understatement. Fights that incorporate a lot of platforming are always challenging, and this one is no exception. The fact that you're fighting in the clouds and everything is constantly moving only makes things worse. This fight would have been difficult even if you were fighting a weak boss, let alone a strong one like Grim. Granted, his attacks aren't the craziest ones you'll encounter in the game, but they're enough to turn a fight into a nightmare when combined with the punishing nature of the level. Not to be confused with Chef Salt Bae. Chef Salt Baker is a new Cuphead boss introduced alongside Delicious Last Course. This chef is the final boss of the DLC, so expect an appropriately difficult fight. Not just that, but this has to be one of the most disturbing fights in the entire game. Yes, even more disturbing than the Esther Winchester fight. Chef Saltbaker is pure evil and tortures defenseless foodstuff throughout the first phase, while throwing everything at you except for the kitchen sink. Things get even creepier from there, but I don't want to spoil anything. This is something that's worth experiencing blind. Last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Kahl's Robot, the hardest Cuphead boss in my opinion, even after the DLC bosses. In fact, this one is so difficult, it made our list of the hardest game bosses of all time. This aerial fight is absolute torture straight out of the gate, to the point where Phase 2 seems to be made intentionally easy just to give yourself some recovery time. But don't worry, because things will ramp up again in Phase 3, when the fight turns into bullet hell. All the aerial boss fights are difficult, but this one is just straight up insane. Once you beat it, if you beat it that is, make sure to give yourself a huge pat on the back. So which one of these bosses did you struggle the most to beat? Which one do you think is the most difficult? Let us know in the comment section below. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're a boss level gamer as well. Until next time, we'll see you later.